There comes a moment, quiet, almost invisible, when everything changes, not because they suddenly transformed, but because you did. You stop chasing. And in that moment, something profound begins to happen. You see, when you were chasing, you were doing more than reaching out. You were buffering them from reality. You were softening the consequences of their distance. You were making it easy for them to stay comfortable in a space where they never had to fully show up. But the second you step back, truly step back, you remove that cushion, and now they are left alone with something they've been avoiding for a very long time: themselves. At first, it doesn't look like anything has changed. In fact, it may even feel like they don't care at all. Silence, distance, maybe even relief on their end. But here's what you must understand. Avoidant patterns don't react loudly, they react internally. When your presence disappears, the noise of their life quiets just enough for something unfamiliar to creep in. Awareness. Awareness of your absence. Awareness of what you gave. Awareness of what they no longer have access to. And this is the moment where the shift begins. Not because you forced it, not because you convinced them, but because you finally stopped interfering with their process. There is a divine principle at work here. What we resist feeling will wait for us in silence until we are ready to face it. And your chasing was allowing them to keep resisting. But your stillness is where truth lives. Now, they may begin to replay conversations. They may start to feel the emptiness where your warmth once existed. They may even reach for distractions to avoid it, but something has already changed. Because now, the connection is no longer something they can take for granted. But listen carefully. This is not your victory. Your victory is not in whether they feel it. Your victory is in the fact that you finally chose yourself over the need to be chosen. Because chasing is not love. It's fear dressed up as effort. And when you release that fear, when you decide, I will no longer abandon myself to keep someone else comfortable, you step into a different kind of power. A power that doesn't beg. A power that doesn't chase. A power that simply stands and allows others to rise to meet it or fall away. Yes, there is a chance they will feel your absence. Yes, there is a chance they will realize what they lost. But there is also a truth you must anchor yourself in. Not everyone who feels the loss will have the courage to grow from it. And that's okay, because your journey was never about awakening them. It was about awakening you. So let them feel it. Let them sit in the space you once filled. Let them come to their own understanding, or not. But you keep walking, because the moment you stopped chasing wasn't the moment they started feeling. It was the moment you started becoming. Chasing, in its essence, creates a kind of emotional environment that feels safe for someone who is avoidant. Not safe in the healthy, grounded sense of the word, but safe in the sense that they are never truly required to confront themselves. When you are the one constantly reaching out, initiating conversations, fixing misunderstandings, or trying to pull them closer, you are unintentionally taking on the emotional labor of the connection. You become the one managing the tension, the distance, and even the uncertainty. And in doing so, you remove the very pressure that might have otherwise prompted them to reflect, to question, or to step forward. For an avoidant, closeness can feel overwhelming because it threatens their sense of independence or exposes emotional territory they are not comfortable navigating. But when you are chasing, closeness exists on their terms. They can engage when it suits them, withdraw when it feels intense, and return knowing you will still be there, ready to re-establish the connection. This creates a dynamic where they are never truly at risk of losing you. And without that risk, there is little reason for them to challenge their own patterns. Your pursuit becomes predictable. It becomes part of the rhythm they rely on. Even if they don't consciously recognize it, they begin to expect your messages, your efforts, your attempts to bridge the gap. And that expectation acts as a shield, protecting them from having to experience the discomfort of absence or the consequences of emotional distance. In a strange way, your consistency becomes the very thing that allows their inconsistency to continue. There is also something deeper happening beneath the surface. When you chase, you are often trying to secure connection, to feel chosen, to bring clarity where there is confusion. But to the avoidant, this can feel like pressure, even when it comes from a place of care. And instead of moving toward that pressure, they cope by leaning further into distance. Yet because you continue to close that distance for them, they never have to fully sit with what their withdrawal creates. So a pattern forms. You reach, they retreat. You repair, they relax. You question, they deflect. And through it all, the emotional responsibility remains uneven. Not because you intended it that way, but because chasing naturally shifts the balance. What's important to understand is that this dynamic doesn't make them feel more connected. It makes them feel more comfortable staying exactly as they are. There is no interruption to their provisional way of relating. No moment where they are forced to ask, what am I doing? What might I lose? What do I actually feel? Because every time that moment begins to approach, your effort fills the space before it can fully form. In this way, chasing doesn't just express your feelings, it regulates theirs. It keeps their discomfort at a manageable level. It allows them to experience connection without the vulnerability that real connection requires. And over time, this creates an illusion of closeness that lacks true emotional depth. They may enjoy your presence, they may appreciate what you bring, but they are not being stretched, challenged, or called into something deeper. Because the dynamic as it stands doesn't require it of them. And without that requirement, without that moment where they must either step forward or face the loss, they remain in a state of emotional neutrality, never fully in, never completely out, and never truly forced to feel the weight of what the connection means. When you stop chasing, something subtle but deeply disruptive happens in the dynamic. You remove their sense of control, not control in an obvious or manipulative way, but the quiet, underlying certainty they had about how the relationship would function. As long as you were the one reaching out, following up, and reinitiating connection, there was a structure they could rely on. They didn't have to think too hard about where they stood with you, because your actions were always filling in the blanks. Control, for someone with avoidant tendencies, often looks like emotional predictability. They may not consciously think, I have control over this person, but they do feel a kind of ease knowing the connection will still be there without requiring too much from them. Your messages, your patience, your willingness to keep things going, all of it creates a safety net. And within that safety net, they can engage at their own pace without ever feeling the full weight of responsibility. But the moment you step back, that structure collapses. Suddenly, the rhythm they were used to is gone. The expected message doesn't come. The follow-up never arrives. When you are present in someone's life, especially in a dynamic where you are the one giving, initiating, and sustaining the emotional connection, you become a kind of constant background noise. Not noise in a negative sense, but in a way that fills space so completely that certain feelings never get the chance to fully surface. Your texts, your reassurance, your attention, your efforts to keep things alive, they occupy the emotional environment. And while that presence may feel like love to you, it often acts as a buffer for them. It softens everything. It softens the impact of their inconsistency. It softens the weight of their absence. It softens the consequences of not fully showing up, because no matter how distant they become, your presence is still there to stabilize the connection. You are, in many ways, absorbing the emotional gaps they leave behind. But when that presence disappears, when the messages stop, when the effort is no longer there, when the energy you once poured into the connection is withdrawn, something powerful happens. Silence takes its place. And silence has a very different effect. Silence doesn't distract. It doesn't reassure. It doesn't compensate. It simply exists. And in that existence, it creates space. Space that was never there before. Space where thoughts can echo. Space where emotions that were once muted begin to rise to the surface. This is where the shift begins, because everything your presence once softened now becomes more pronounced. The distance feels heavier. The lack of connection feels more real. The absence is no longer cushioned by your efforts. It stands on its own, undeniable and unfiltered. For someone with avoidant tendencies, this can be deeply uncomfortable. Not because they immediately understand what they feel, but because they are no longer shielded from feeling anything at all. Your presence once gave them something to respond to, something to lean on without fully engaging. But your silence removes that option. Now, they are left alone with the reality of the connection as it truly is, not as it was maintained by you. And in that quiet, something unfamiliar begins to happen. They may start to notice the gaps, the times they would normally hear from you but don't, the energy that used to come toward them but is no longer there. And with that noticing comes a subtle awareness. Something is missing. At first, they might try to ignore it. They might distract themselves, tell themselves it doesn't matter, or assume you'll eventually return to the pattern they're used to. But silence has a way of lingering. It doesn't demand attention, yet it slowly commands it. Because silence doesn't just remove you, it removes the escape from themselves. And this is where emotions that were once buried begin to surface. Not all at once, not always clearly, but gradually. A thought here, a memory there, a fleeting feeling they can't quite name. Your presence used to keep those things at bay, not intentionally, but effectively. Now, without that constant interaction, there is nothing to interrupt the internal process. Silence becomes a mirror. It reflects back to them what the connection actually meant, what it felt like, and what its absence now creates. And that reflection can be unsettling, because it forces them to confront something they've long avoided: emotional impact. They may begin to replay moments. Conversations that once felt casual may take on new meaning. Your effort, taken for granted, may now be seen more clearly in its absence. And even if they don't fully understand what they're feeling, they begin to feel something they weren't allowing themselves to feel before. That is the power of silence. Not as a tactic, not as a punishment, but as a natural consequence of your withdrawal. It doesn't chase, it doesn't explain, it doesn't negotiate. It simply allows reality to exist without interference. And in that reality, what was once muted by your constant presence begins to speak, quietly at first, but with a depth that cannot be ignored. One of the most confusing and often painful realities of dealing with someone who has avoidant tendencies is this: their emotional experience doesn't follow the same timeline as yours. Where you may feel things in the moment, connection, hurt, longing, clarity, they often seem unaffected, distant, or even indifferent. And it can leave you questioning everything. Did it mean anything to them? Did they ever feel what you felt? But the truth is, avoidants don't always lack emotion. They delay it. In the moment where connection is present, where vulnerability is required, or where emotional intensity begins to rise, their instinct is often to suppress, deflect, or disconnect. Not because they are incapable of feeling, but because feeling deeply can be overwhelming for them. It challenges the internal systems they built to stay safe, independent, and in control. So instead of leaning into those emotions, they step away from them. This is why, during the relationship or interaction, you might feel like you're the only one carrying the emotional weight. You express, you reflect, you try to understand, while they seem to minimize, avoid, or shut down. It creates a painful imbalance, one where your experience is immediate and theirs appears almost non-existent. But what's really happening is not absence. It's postponement. They are pushing their emotional responses out of the present moment because they don't yet have the capacity or willingness to process them. And as long as the connection is active, especially if you are the one maintaining it, they can continue to avoid that process. Your presence gives them just enough engagement to stay connected, but not enough pressure to force emotional confrontation. However, when the connection is disrupted, when you stop chasing, when your presence is no longer there to stabilize things, something begins to shift internally. The emotions they avoided don't disappear. They wait. And without the immediate demands of the relationship, without the pressure of having to respond or engage in real time, those delayed emotions begin to surface. But they surface differently, slower, more quietly, sometimes in fragments rather than clarity. They might not wake up one day with a sudden, overwhelming realization. Instead, it can come in waves, a memory that lingers longer than expected, a sense of emptiness they can't quite explain. A moment where they think of you and feel something unfamiliar, something they didn't allow themselves to feel before. This delayed processing is often why avoidants seem unaffected at first and then, much later, begin to show signs of reflection or even regret. It's not that they suddenly started caring, it's that they are finally allowing themselves to feel what they couldn't face before. But even then, it doesn't always translate into action, because feeling something and knowing what to do with it are two very different things. They may recognize your value in hindsight. They may understand on some level what the connection meant or what they lost, but if they haven't developed the emotional tools to process those feelings in a healthy way, they can remain stuck in internal conflict aware, but inactive. This is why their timing can feel so misaligned with yours. By the time they begin to feel, you may have already gone through the full cycle: hope, confusion, pain, acceptance, and healing. And what once felt urgent to you may no longer hold the same weight. It's important to see this clearly because it reframes the narrative. Their delayed response is not a reflection of your worth or the depth of the connection. It's a reflection of their emotional conditioning, their learned way of coping with closeness and vulnerability. And while it may be tempting to wait for that moment when they finally get it, when they finally feel what you felt, the deeper truth is this: their realization, whenever it comes, belongs to their journey, not yours. You experience the connection in real time. They are only beginning to catch up to it after it's already gone quiet. There is a moment in every emotionally imbalanced dynamic where you are faced with a quiet but defining choice. Continue pursuing someone who is uncertain about you, or turn inward and choose yourself with certainty. And while chasing can feel active, hopeful, even loving, self-respect carries a different kind of power. One that doesn't beg for connection, but embodies it from within. When you chase, your focus is outward. You are watching their behavior, analyzing their responses, trying to interpret their silence, adjusting yourself to maintain proximity. Your energy becomes tied to their availability. If they lean in, you feel relief. If they pull away, you feel anxiety. Over time, this creates a subtle dependency, not necessarily on them as a person, but on their reactions to validate your sense of security in the connection. But self-respect shifts that entire orientation. It brings your attention back to what you are participating in rather than what you are trying to preserve. It asks a different set of questions, not how do I get them to choose me, but what am I accepting right now? Not what do they feel about me, but how do I feel in this dynamic? And those questions can be uncomfortable because they require honesty without illusion. Self-respect doesn't ignore your feelings. It honors them by refusing to place them in situations where they are consistently dismissed, minimized, or left unresolved. It recognizes that your desire for connection is valid, but it also understands that desire alone cannot sustain something that lacks mutual effort. When you operate from self-respect, your actions begin to change, not as a strategy to influence them, but as a reflection of your own standards. You stop over-explaining. You stop chasing clarity from someone who avoids giving it. You stop filling in the gaps they leave behind. And most importantly, you stop negotiating with behavior that doesn't align with what you truly need. This is where the shift becomes powerful, because while chasing tries to create connection through effort, self-respect creates clarity through absence. It removes the extra energy that was compensating for the imbalance and allows the dynamic to reveal itself as it really is. Without your constant input, there is nothing left to mask the truth of their investment. And that truth, whatever it may be, becomes easier to see. Self-respect also changes the way you are perceived, not because you are performing or trying to send a message, but because your energy is no longer rooted in pursuit. There is a groundedness that comes from knowing you will not abandon yourself to maintain someone else's comfort. And that groundedness naturally commands a different level of attention. It's not loud, it's not forceful, but it is deeply felt, because when you stop chasing, you are no longer trying to convince someone of your value, you are living in alignment with it. And that creates a presence that is harder to overlook, precisely because it does not seek validation. For someone who is used to your pursuit, this shift can be disorienting. They may not immediately understand what has changed, but they will feel the difference. The accessibility they once relied on is no longer guaranteed. The reassurance they passively received is no longer there. And in its place is something unfamiliar, a boundary they cannot cross without effort. But the most important impact of self-respect is not on them, it's on you. It restores your sense of agency. Instead of reacting to their behavior, you begin to respond to your own values. Instead of waiting for them to show up differently, you start showing up differently for yourself. And in that process, your emotional stability becomes less dependent on external validation and more anchored in internal alignment. You begin to feel the difference between connection that flows and connection that must be forced. You recognize the cost of overgiving. You understand that love in its healthiest form does not require you to shrink, chase, or constantly prove your worth. And once you truly embody that understanding, chasing no longer feels like effort. It feels like misalignment, because self-respect has shown you something deeper, that the right connection will not require you to lose yourself in order to keep it. One of the most important and often hardest truths to accept in this dynamic is that just because someone begins to feel your absence, it doesn't mean they will act on it. There is a powerful distinction between emotional awareness and emotional responsibility, and many people never fully bridge that gap. When you step back and your presence is no longer there to sustain the connection, it can absolutely create space for realization. They may start to notice what's missing. They may feel the absence of your consistency, your warmth, your effort. They may even experience moments of regret, curiosity, or longing. But feeling some, even internally, and choosing to do something about it externally are two completely different processes. Action requires more than emotion. It requires courage, self-awareness, and a willingness to step outside of one's provisional patterns. And for someone with avoidant tendencies, that step can feel incredibly uncomfortable. It asks them to move toward vulnerability, to risk rejection, to admit that they may have been wrong or that they lost something meaningful. These are not small emotional leaps. They challenge the very defenses that have kept them feeling safe. So even if they begin to feel the weight of your absence, they may hesitate. They may think about reaching out, but stop themselves. They may replay memories, but tell themselves it's better to move on. They may acknowledge, on some level, that you mattered, but still avoid taking the kind of action that would require real emotional exposure. This is where many people get stuck, waiting for the message, waiting for the apology, waiting for the moment when the other person finally translates their feelings into effort. And that waiting can feel justified, especially if you sense that something has shifted on their end. But it's also where you risk placing your life on pause for a possibility that may never fully materialize, because not everyone who feels something has the capacity to act on it. Some people stay in their internal world, processing quietly but never expressing. Others minimize their feelings as a way to avoid discomfort. And some simply choose the path of least resistance, even if it means letting something meaningful slip away. This isn't always because they don't care. Sometimes it's because caring requires a version of them they haven't yet developed. And that's a difficult reality to sit with because it forces you to separate intention from impact. You may believe they died, not mean to hurt you, didn't mean to lose the connection, didn't mean to create distance. But regardless of their intentions, the impact remains the same if no action follows. What matters in the real world of relationships is not just what someone feels. It's what they do with what they feel. Do they communicate? Do they take steps to repair, to grow, to meet you where you are? Or do they remain in a cycle of internal reflection without external change? This is why it's so important not to anchor your decisions in what they might be feeling beneath the surface. Because feelings that never translate into behavior cannot build or sustain a healthy connection. You deserve something that exists not just in potential, but in reality. And while it's natural to hope that your absence will awaken something in them, that awakening only matters if it leads to meaningful, consistent action. Not a moment of vulnerability followed by withdrawal, not a brief return followed by the same patterns, but real, sustained effort that reflects growth. Anything less than that keeps you in the same cycle, just with a different phase. Understanding this creates a kind of clarity that protects you. It allows you to acknowledge that yes, they may feel your absence, but it also reminds you that their feelings alone are not enough to build the kind of relationship you're seeking. And once you truly accept that, you begin to shift your focus away from what they might do and back to what you will no longer tolerate. At some point in this journey, the focus has to shift from them back to you, not as a strategy, not as a way to provoke a reaction, but as a genuine return to your own center. Because as long as your healing is tied to whether they feel something, realize something, or come back with something, you are still emotionally anchored to the very dynamic that has been, draining you. It's easy to believe that the ultimate resolution lies in their awakening. That if they finally understand your value, if they finally feel the loss, if they finally show up differently, it will bring you the closure or validation you've been seeking. But that belief quietly keeps you in a waiting position, where your sense of peace is still dependent on their timeline, their growth, their choices. True healing begins the moment you release that dependency. Not because what you felt wasn't real, and not because what you shared didn't matter, but because your life cannot remain on hold for someone else's realization. Healing asks you to reclaim the energy you once poured into understanding them and redirect it toward understanding yourself, your patterns, your boundaries, your needs, and the ways in which you may have overextended in the hope of preserving connection. There is a kind of clarity that emerges when you stop asking, why didn't they choose me? And start asking, why did I stay in something that required me to chase? That question is not about blame, it's about awareness. It invites you to look at the parts of yourself that tolerated inconsistency, that tried to earn stability, that confused effort with mutual investment. And within that awareness is where your power begins to return. Because healing is not just about moving on from someone, it's about realigning with yourself. It's about recognizing that your worth was never something to be proven through persistence or sacrifice. It was always something to be honored through the standards you set and the boundaries you maintain. As you begin to heal, your perspective changes. The connection that once felt all-consuming starts to look different. Not necessarily smaller in significance, but clearer in reality. You see where things were unbalanced. You see where you gave more than was by, NG reciprocated. And instead of feeling the urge to fix it, you begin to feel a quiet acceptance of what it was and what it wasn't. This acceptance is not resignation, it's freedom. Freedom from trying to rewrite the past. Freedom from hoping someone will become who you needed them to be. Freedom from the emotional loop of analyzing, waiting, and wondering. And in that freedom, something new begins to take shape. A stronger sense of self. You start to trust your instincts again. You become more attuned to how people show up, not just what they say. You develop a deeper respect for your own emotional experience, no longer dismissing it in order to keep someone else close. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to understand that love should not feel like something you have to chase in order to keep. This is where the real transformation happens. Because once you have experienced what it feels like to choose yourself, truly choose yourself, you cannot easily return to a dynamic where your needs are secondary. The standard within you has shifted. The tolerance for inconsistency has lowered, and the desire for mutual grounded connection has become non-negotiable. That doesn't mean you stop caring. It doesn't mean you erase what you felt or pretend it didn't matter. It means you place those feelings in a context that honors your growth rather than traps you in your past. And here's the quiet truth. The moment you fully step into your healing is the moment their role in your story changes. They are no longer the center of your emotional world. They become a chapter, important, yes, but no longer defining. Because your healing is not about what they lost. It's about what you found within yourself when you finally stopped losing you. Thank you for trusting me with your thoughts and time, wishing you clarity and strength on your journey. Goodbye for now. May your path forward be filled with growth, peace, and self-discovery.